Thanks for joining us for the monthly Hacks Roundup. Today we'll cover every major Web3 hack in April. Make sure you're subscribed so you can catch next month's roundup as soon as possible. In April, hackers stole over $103 million from the Web3 ecosystem. Of that, $51 million were lost due to smart contract hacks. Rug pulls and scams accounted for $47 million of losses, and finally, compromised keys accounted for over $2 million of losses. Let's start with the largest smart contract hack in April, and the victim in this case was Hedgey Finance. Hedgey Finance provides token infrastructure, including token vesting, token lockups, grants, as well as distributions. The claims campaign contract was the vulnerable contract in the case of this hack, and was primarily used for community token claims. The contract had previously been used to distribute tokens for over 100 different projects, and in those cases, it was successfully done without issue. However, on April 19th, the contract was hacked for over $45 million worth of tokens on multiple chains, including Ethereum, Arbitrum, Phantom, as well as a few others. The root cause in this case was a combination of insufficient validation as well as bad approval hygiene. If a user wants to create a campaign for distributing tokens with Hedgey, they have to call the create lock campaign function on the claims campaign contract. When they do this, they transfer a bunch of tokens into the claims campaign contract to distribute to these users. Also, what happens here is that a token approval is granted to the token lockup contract. Now, if that user cancels the campaign in order to receive their tokens back, what happens, or rather what doesn't happen in this case, is that the approval to the token lockup contract is not revoked. This means that the token lockup contract still has permission to transfer tokens from the claims campaign contract. So this is the first problem that led to the hack. The second problem is that the user could specify any arbitrary address for the token lockup contract. And in the case of the attack, the hacker specified the attack contract's address as the token lockup contract address. And so this resulted in the token approval being granted to the attack contract instead of the token lockup contract. So when the attacker canceled the campaign, they received their tokens back here, but also what happened is that the attack contract still had an approval to transfer tokens from the claims campaign contract, and what the attacker did next in this case is simply transfer the tokens from the contract. Here's the code for the create lock campaign function. And you can see that the only validation that happens here on the token locker address is a zero address check, where basically we're just making sure that it's not the zero address. And so it could be any other arbitrary address. That's why the attacker was able to set this as the attack contract address. And over here, we can see where the allowance is granted. You can see that we're granting the allowance for the campaign token, for the token locker address, which in the case of the attack, this was the attack contract address, for some amount here that's specified by the user. Next, we have the cancel campaign function, and you can see that nowhere in this function does it revoke the approval given to the token locker contract. Let's review the steps of this hack. First, the attacker takes a flash loan of USDC from Balancer. Next, the attacker calls the create lock campaign function. This is going to transfer some tokens into the claims campaign contract, but it's also going to grant the attack contract approval to take some tokens from the claims campaign contract. Next, the attack contract calls the cancel campaign contract function and receives the deposited USDC back. However, the token approval for the attack contract remains unchanged. And so in the next step, the attacker uses this approval in order to transfer functions, or rather to transfer tokens from the claims campaign contract back to their own account. Next, the attacker simply repeats this process with a different token. There were over 17 transactions involved in the attack, and this happened over a span of 2 hours. The theft of each individual asset involved 2 transactions. So the first transaction manipulated the approvals, and the second transaction took advantage of that approval by transferring tokens from the claims campaign contract. Fortunately, an MEV bot operator was able to front-run some of the attacks and recover at least some funds. Now, Hedgey responded quickly to warn the associated projects which had these campaigns going on to distribute tokens, for example, the Bonus Block project. And in the case of Bonus Block, they were actually able to remove liquidity from the DEX and freeze deposits on the centralized exchange to save that liquidity. The team sent the attacker an on-chain message in an attempt to recover some of the lost funds, but it has not received a response. The team also plans to have 5 new audits completed in May, and it will create a new bug bounty program as well. In order to prevent these types of hacks, we have to be really careful about our token approval hygiene. Token approvals should not be granted unless they are expected to be used immediately, and they should be cleared when necessary as well. And in this case, that didn't happen. Also, address parameters should always be carefully validated, especially if these addresses are being given token approvals or some values being transferred to them, or if some functions being called on them. One way to detect missing input validation is to have extensive unit testing. Let's move on to the second largest smart contract hack in April, which happened on Pike Finance. So Pike Finance is a cross-chain lending protocol. It lets you deposit collateral on one chain and then borrow from a different chain. The protocol integrates with a bunch of different technologies, including Wormhole, Circle's cross-chain transfer protocol, and Gelato, which we'll cover a bit more in a few minutes. The protocol was hacked twice in April in a span of a few days. In fact, in a span of about 5 days. The first hack happened on April 26th, and it was caused primarily by insufficient validation. This hack resulted in a loss of 300K. The second hack happened just 4 days later on April 30th, and this resulted from a bug in the fix for that first hack, and it led to an even worse loss of 1.6 million. The hacks occurred across multiple chains, including Ethereum, Arbitrum, as well as Optimism. So let's first explain what Circle's CCTP as well as Gelato is. So Circle's CCTP, or cross-chain transfer protocol, is a protocol that allows users to transfer USDC across any two supported chains. The user can first call a function on Circle's token messenger contract in order to burn the USDC on the source chain. The token messenger contract is going to use another of Circle's contracts in order to send a cross-chain message to the destination chain. And then the user can create a transaction on the destination chain in order to mint USDC there. Now, the relaying service known as Gelato also integrates with CCTP, and this allows you to automatically mint on the destination chain without the user having to manually create the mint transaction themselves. A few days before the hack, the Pike Finance team announced that it supported USDC withdrawals through CCTP, or Circle's cross-chain transfer protocol. However, due to insufficient validation in one of these functions, the attacker was able to steal the protocol's USDC. So here is the hack, the first transaction of the hack. This one was on Ethereum, and you can see here we have the attacker's EOA, which is the sender, and the receiver over here is a Pike contract. So a function on the Pike contract is being called, and here we have a breakdown of the input. So the number 6 over here represents the destination chain, which in this case is base, as in the base layer 2. Then we have the attacker's address, which is 0x Then we have the USDC address, as well as the amount of USDC being transferred. So let's take a closer look at this transaction. We see over here in this transaction that after the Pike contract is called over here, the token messenger contract, this is Circle's token messenger contract, is called. And specifically, the deposit for burn function is called. This is the entry point for Circle's CCTP protocol. And you can see that the mint recipient here is actually not the attacker's address. The attacker's address is 0x this time it's 0xA94. So this account actually represents Gelato, the Gelato account for relaying the transaction on base. And we'll see more of that in a bit. So the next thing that happens here is that the token minter contract is going to burn these USDC tokens on the source chain, which in this case is Ethereum. And then this other contract, which is also built by Circle, is going to send a cross-chain message to base. And this will allow USDC to be minted on base. So this transaction happened on Ethereum. Now we're going to look at the next transaction, which happened on base. So this transaction was initiated by Gelato. And Gelato in this case is going to call its all contract with the function exec with sig relayer context. And what's going to happen here is that the USDC that was transferred from Ethereum is going to be minted over here. However, it's minted to the Gelato relayer account, not the attacker's account immediately. However, after this mint, you can see that it is being transferred to the attacker's account, which is this 0x address over here. So effectively, what the attacker has done here is they have transferred USDC from the protocol contract to their own account on a different chain. So the team was warned about the vulnerability by the auditor, but they did not fix the vulnerability in a timely manner, and this was something they admitted in the postmortem. As we've mentioned before, address parameters should always be carefully validated. And as we've also mentioned, extensive unit testing can help define these cases of missing validation. So the team responded by upgrading the contract to add a pause feature because they wanted to pause the contract in order to stop this hack from happening again. Unfortunately, this upgrade added a bug that was exploited in the second hack. So after this upgrade happened, the team immediately paused all operations on the protocol. However, when this upgrade happened, the Pike team added a dependency with an additional storage variable. So one of the existing storage variables before this upgrade was the initialization flag, and this tells you whether the smart contract has been initialized or not. Now, since this smart contract had been initialized a long time ago, the initialization flag was set to true. But because this new additional storage variable was added, the storage slot for the initialization flag moved forward. It moved forward to an empty slot which had no data, which made it look like the contract was not initialized. And so the attacker was able to reinitialize the contract and thus give themselves admin privileges. They then upgraded the implementation to a malicious one and called a function which drained all ether from the contract. So here is the decompiled code for the initialization function, and you can see that there is a check here to make sure that the contract has not already been initialized. But because the storage layout was changed, the initialization check over here was bypassed. And you can see that some important variable here is being set to the caller's address. Now here is the transaction trace for the second hack. You can see that the attacker is calling a function on the attack contract, and the attack contract is going to proceed to reinitialize the Pike contract, and you can see that the owner variable is being set to the attack contract. Next, the attacker is going to upgrade the implementation, and they upgrade this implementation to the attack contract. Now that they've upgraded the implementation to the attack contract, they essentially have full control of this contract, and they make a call into this contract, which is going to do a delegate call into the attack contract, and specifically it's going to call a malicious function here, which is going to transfer all the ether from this contract to the attacker. So this version of Pike was known as Pike Beta, and it has now been sunset. The team will make users whole by borrowing USDC against some tokens in their treasury, and this USDC will then be used to purchase assets which were lost by users and then directly refund them these assets. The team is offering a 20% reward for information leading to the return of funds, and also some of the pre-sale investors have been requesting a refund, but so far they've not been successful in this. So this type of vulnerability or this type of hack can be prevented by being really careful about the storage slots for your original contract's variables when you're making an upgrade. One thing that can help with this is to have storage gaps in your dependency contracts. That way, even if you need to introduce a storage variable in between the dependencies, you can still do it without changing the storage layout. It's also worth testing important state variables after deployment, for example, the initialization flag. If you've made a deployment and you do a sanity check to make sure that the contract is still initialized, and you see that the initialization flag is set to false, you would immediately know that something is wrong. Also, we have to use caution when upgrading contracts quickly in response to a hack. Now, of course, we do need to respond to the hack fast in order to prevent more damage, but caution also needs to be used. It also can help to have the pause functionality implemented initially rather than having to introduce it in an upgrade. Let's move on to XBridge, which was the third largest smart contract hack in April. XBridge is a cross-chain protocol that allows the bridging of tokens between Ethereum as well as the BNB chain without a transfer tax. XBridge is built by Zeeshan, which originally evolved from the Saitama meme coin. So this bridge mainly supports tokens associated with the Zeeshan ecosystem, for example, SDC, which is the Zeeshan token, SRLTY, which is Zeeta Realty token, as well as Maisie, which is another project associated with the Zeeshan ecosystem. On April 24th, XBridge was hacked for 1.4 million on Ethereum as well as the BNB chain due to insufficient validation. So in order to make XBridge support a token for bridging, you have to call the list token function. And in this function, you provide the address of the token on Ethereum as well as the BNB chain. When you call this function, it makes you the token owner of the token on the origin chain and gives you the right to deposit and withdraw liquidity. So as you can imagine, this function is meant to be called once per pair because it sets someone as the token owner. However, due to insufficient validation, this allowed the attacker to re-register the pair with a different chain ID and then become the token owner. And once they were the token owner, it was very easy for them to withdraw liquidity. So here is the function for listing a new token pair. And you can see that the most important parameters here are the base token chain ID, the corresponding token chain ID, as well as the address on the base chain and the address on the corresponding chain. So let's take an example of a token where we have address X, which is for the token on Ethereum, and then address Y, which is the address of the token on the BNB chain. The chain ID for Ethereum would be 1, and the chain ID for BNB in this case would be 6. So if that's the input provided, you can see that the mappings are initialized with those inputs in these 4 lines over here. And this line over here is going to check whether the pair has already been listed. And it does this by trying to resolve this mapping and making sure it's not the 0 address. And it wouldn't be the 0 address if it has already been initialized in these 4 lines. Later on, you can see that the token owner for the base token is being set to the caller's address. And so if you try to rerun this function with the same parameters, this check should fail because this mapping will not resolve to the 0 address. But the attacker in this case set the chain ID to some other number when they reran the function. And they kept the address of the base token and the corresponding token to be the same. And so this allowed them to bypass this check over here. And this finally allowed the attacker to set their own address as the token owner. And once they were the token owner, they could simply withdraw the funds. So in the first transaction, the attacker simply calls the list token function with some fake chain IDs in order to bypass that check and set themselves as the token owner. Now that they're the token owner in the second transaction, they can simply withdraw tokens from the bridge. So there were 2 transactions for each asset stolen, as we saw in the previous slide. And the sidechain team released a statement acknowledging the attack on X. The XBridge website was taken down, and as of early May, the XBridge website was still down. In order to prevent this type of attack, you could do it by doing more extensive testing, in particular, trying to rerun that list token function with the same pair. It would be reasonable to find that attack scenario by trying to run different test cases on this list token function. Also, as we've mentioned before, address parameters should be carefully validated. Finally, a fast enough response would allow us to pause the protocol before some of the assets were stolen and may have prevented some of the damage. Let's move on to some of the other smart contract hacks which happened in April. Firstly, we have the Zest protocol, which was hacked for 1 million on the Stacks chain. So Zest is actually the first lending protocol deployed on Stacks, which is a Bitcoin Layer 2 network. Smart contracts on Stacks use the Clarity programming language, which is very different from Solidity. The function for borrowing funds on this protocol had a parameter which had a list of collateral possessed by the borrower. And the function would go through each item in this list and verify that the user had actually deposited this collateral. However, the function didn't check for duplicates. And so what the attacker did is they simply deposited one type of collateral, and in this list of collateral, they simply duplicated that one collateral that they did deposit. And so it appeared that their collateral was greatly inflated, and the protocol allowed them to borrow more funds than they really should have been able to borrow. In particular, they were able to borrow about 322k Stacks tokens. And the attack was carried out by calling the borrow function 5 times. Next, we have Summer Money, which was hacked on the base chain. Summer Money is yet another cross-chain lending protocol that was hacked due to a reentrancy exploit. The attacker started by taking a flash loan, depositing some collateral into the protocol, and then borrowing some funds from the protocol. Next, they tried to repay some funds by calling the repay borrow behalf function. But when they did that, they sent too much ether to the contract. Now, the behavior of this contract is that it will refund the extra ether back to the caller before making some important state changes, thus violating the checks effects interactions pattern. Now, when they refund this extra ether to the caller, since the caller is the attack contract, the fallback function on the attack contract is invoked. So the attack contract makes some additional calls to the same contract in order to manipulate the SDR ETH to ETH exchange rate. And finally, the attacker is able to redeem SDR ETH for an excessive amount of ETH because this exchange rate has been manipulated. Next, we have Open Leverage, which was hacked on the BNB chain as well as Arbitrum for 260K. The root cause in this case was an accounting error related to the debt. Firstly, the attacker opens a position by calling the trade function, and within this call, an additional external call was made, which created an additional position with minimal collateral. And since this position had such little collateral, it was immediately liquidated. But due to that bug in the accounting, the debt for the original position was also wiped out. And in the second transaction, the attacker was thus able to withdraw all the collateral from the margin positions. Next, we have the Fengshu token, which was hacked on the BNB chain for 191K. The attacker in this case called the vulnerable delegate call reserves function, which lacked access control. This let them set an important storage address to the attack contract's address, and this let them manipulate the balance of the attack contract's address to be much higher. Next, we have ATM on the BNB chain. The token implementation involved making some swaps using a DEX pool. However, the swap functionality did not include sufficient slippage protection, and so the attacker was able to perform sandwich attacks on these swaps to make a profit. Next, we have Yeedle on the BNB chain, which was hacked for 150K. In this case, there was a redeem function which did not have enough validation. And so the attacker was able to redeem funds without having any shares in the protocol. Next, we have the Z123 token on the BNB chain, which was a classic reserve or price manipulation hack on a DEX pool. Basically, each swap made in the DEX resulted in more Z123 tokens being burned from the pool. Finally, there were a very small amount of tokens of Z123 in the pool, and so this let the attacker swap a small amount of Z123 for a very large amount of stablecoin. Next, we have Magpie protocol on Ethereum. This was hacked due to an arbitrary external call that allowed the attacker to manipulate the router contract. Basically, the router contract was manipulated into transferring funds from the users which had approved it to the attacker. The contract did have some validation which tried to constrain which function selector was called, but the attacker was able to execute the attack even within these constraints. Next, we have Mars, which was hacked on the BNB chain. This was another classic reserve manipulation hack whereby the attacker was able to manipulate the reserve of the DEX pool in order to get more favorable prices. Next, we have the Squid Game token on the BNB chain. In this case, the hacker took a flash loan of WratBNB and made a large swap from WratBNB to Squid in PancakeSwap. Now, there was also some functionality in the Squid token swap contract which allowed for the swapping or allowed the contract to be forced to swap WratBNB to Squid token. And this is exactly what the attacker did. They forced the contract to make a very unfavorable swap from WratBNB to Squid. And then the attacker simply made a reverse swap in order to make a profit. Let's move on to the rug pulls and scams which happened in April. Firstly, we have Z Casino, which resulted in a loss of $33 million for users. The team simply moved 10,500 ETH deposited by users without any warning. The project had shown many red flags, which were shown by ZachXBT, including not paying contracts and employees, not canceling IDOs at the very last moment, making insensitive and unprofessional social media posts, as well as not paying out for some user bets. ZachXBT had raised these warnings pretty early on, and Binance helped to identify the leader of the scam through a combination of on-chain tracking and a behavioral network study. They passed on this information to the Dutch police, which arrested the suspect, and they've already seized over $12.2 million of assets in real estate, crypto, and luxury cars. Some funds have been moved back to the Z Casino multisig, indicating the possibility of users being refunded, but the situation has not yet been resolved. Next, we have our classic ERC20, ERC721 phishing scams. These have resulted in losses of over 8.7 million in April. There have been at least 21 separate instances of phishing scams involving these types of tokens. These scams typically work by signing transactions involving approve, permit, and increase allowance functions. The largest individual loss was for about 1.2 million. Then we have Leaper Finance on blast, which pulled the rug for 1 million. Leaper Finance actually claimed to be a lending protocol. However, the team behind it had been behind many other rug pulls as well, including Magnate Finance, Kokomo, as well as Lendora. Now, before deleting their social media profiles, they actually acknowledged that they had North Korean connections. Next, we have the Condom token on Solana, which was a meme coin project. The token's presale collected over 922K worth of SOL. However, the team just stole these pre-sale funds without delivering any value and then proceeded to delete their social media accounts. Let's move on to the key compromises which happened in April. The largest incident in this category was on Grandbase, which was a protocol on the base chain and lost about 2 million. The hacker in this case was able to obtain the keys of the deployer wallet. This deployer wallet was on the PC of the CTO, and the PC itself was compromised. This wallet had some special privileges to mint tokens, and so the attacker used these privileges to mint a huge amount of Grandbase tokens and then sold them, resulting in a price drop of over 90%. The attacker used multiple transactions to mint and swap tokens, and finally the team plans to distribute a new version of the token. Next, we have XBlast on the Blast chain. In this case, the team's main wallet, which contained a large amount of XBlast tokens, were compromised. The attacker stole those tokens and then sold them for ETH. Let's discuss some of the trends we've seen in April. So 2 of the largest 3 smart contracts hacks were caused by insufficient validation on the address parameters, and that included Hedgey as well as XBridge. The smaller Pike Finance hack also involved the insufficient validation on address parameters. Now, at least 5 hacks overall were caused by broken or insufficient validation. In terms of auditing, the vulnerable code had been audited for at least 2 of the 3 largest smart contract hacks. In one case, the auditor had detected the vulnerability and warned the team, but they just didn't fix it. And in the other case, the auditor just didn't detect the vulnerability. 2 of the 3 largest smart contract hacks involved multiple transactions, and some people have speculated that the reason for this pattern of multiple transactions is to avoid front-running by MEV bots. Also, all 3 of the largest smart contract hacks happened on multiple chains. These were basically all multi-chain protocols which were deployed on multiple chains, and the vulnerability was on each of those chains, and so the protocol was hacked on each of those chains. April was also the second month in a row whereby smart contract hacks accounted for over 30% of the overall losses. And this is unusual because smart contract hacks usually account for a smaller percentage of the losses. And in fact, in April, smart contract hacks accounted for almost 50% of the losses. And in the opposite trend, compromised private keys accounted for less than 5% of the losses. And typically, compromised private keys account for most of the losses. So it has been unusual that in the last 2 months, compromised private keys have accounted for a much lower share of the losses. Also, half of the 4 largest scams were by teams involved in previous scams, and that includes Leaper Finance as well as Z Casino. So that brings us to the end of the April Hacks Roundup. There have already been a couple of interesting smart contract hacks in May, and there have also been a couple of huge phishing incidents. So we'll cover those in the May Hacks Roundup, and I hope you'll join us for that as well. Thanks again for joining us, and please follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our channel for more great security content.